Yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Durham. That's not part of the report. It is a lot of what I've heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. One of my colleagues from California said, "I don't know what we're doing here." And what we're doing here is going through this very damning report. The FBI has failed many times over the years that you investigated them. I'd like to ask, did the FBI open Crossfire Hurricane without speaking to the people who provided the information?
Yes.
Did the FBI open Crossfire Hurricane on a Sunday, only 3 days after reviewing the information?
Yes.
Did the FBI open Crossfire Hurricane without any significant review of its own intelligence database?
Yes.
Did the FBI open Crossfire Hurricane without interviewing the essential witnesses?
Yes.
Did the FBI open Crossfire Hurricane without using any of the standard analytical tools typically employed in evaluating intelligence?
Yes.
Did the FBI consider the possibility that it was the target?
It didn't appear so to me from the evidence.
And so I'm curious if you could tell me, because I'm not a prosecutor, some of my colleagues here are, but the average American is not. Can you tell us why and under what motivation would a prosecutorial agency act in such a way where it willfully ignores multiple instances of exculpatory evidence throughout the course of its investigation? Because I just don't understand that.
That, in my experience, that is not the norm. That's not how the FBI performs. In this particular case, as is reflected in the report, there appear to be persons in the FBI who were central to opening the investigation that had rather strong views concerning then candidate Trump.
And we've heard in your report that you reference confirmation bias. And a lot of times, or sometimes, we see that the investigators, perhaps the FBI investigators, they have a confirmation bias because they want a guilty outcome. They want to find the suspect guilty. But we did not see that to be the case for Hillary Clinton. So it makes me think that based on the investigation into the conduct and the continuous disregard for duty, there was obviously a special motivation to find this suspect, Donald Trump and his campaign, guilty above anyone else. Would you agree?
I can speak to what the facts show, as documented in the report. Again, people draw their reasonable inferences, conclusions from those facts with an honest reading of the report.
If either you or someone on your team willfully ignored exculpatory evidence, refused to interview key witnesses, favored one suspect over another, or did any or all of the things that the FBI did during Crossfire Hurricane, would you face repercussions?
There ought to be repercussions. If that ever happened in connection with an agent that I was working with and I knew about it, the first thing would be to report it to the court, and the probably second thing would be to report it to their superiors. The third thing would be sure that that agent never worked with me again.
I appreciate that. I also appreciate your remarks earlier in your open testimony where you said, "My colleagues and I carried out our work in good faith, with integrity, in the spirit of following the facts wherever they lead, without fear or favor." I believe you did that. I'm disappointed in some of my colleagues that have said disparaging remarks about you. I've seen very few that actually talk about your report. They want to talk about everything else, which tells me you're onto something. I'd also yield the balance of my time to the chairman.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding. So Danchenko is the primary subsource. A few years before he does this work, he was investigated by the FBI for espionage. Is that right, Mr. Durham?
Correct.
And that case was halted because the FBI thought he left the country, right?
Correct.
Had he left the country?
No.
Where was he living?
He remained living in the place that he was living when they opened the investigation.
Right here in D.C., right?
Yeah.
He hadn't left anywhere. He's right here in D.C., and we're going to stop this. And then they go hire him, use the tax money of the people I get the privilege of representing to pay this guy who they obviously knew was a Russian spy. They hire him, who's the source of all the false information. Is that true?
They paid him, they hired him, and they paid him.
Couple $100,000 if I recall, right?
It was over $200,000.
Yeah, and then this guy is hanging out with Dolan, Charles Dolan, who's a buddy of the Clintons, who's also a source for the false dossier that was used to spy on an American citizen. He's hanging out with Dolan. In fact, don't they meet on a park bench somewhere in Arlington, Virginia on New Year's Day?
New Year's Day, middle of the day.
I mean, this is straight out of the movies, right? And the FBI says, but we're not going to talk to Charles Dolan. mean, this is two of the dumbest things I've ever heard of. They won't talk, they pay a guy who's a Russian spy who's the source of the dossier. The other source of the dossier is Charles Dolan, who meets with that guy on a park bench in Arlington, and they don't want to interview him. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. But that's what Comey's FBI did. And they're still doing this kind of baloney because Mr. D'Antuono told us so, running operations, running investigations out of headquarters instead of assigning a U.S. attorney, a job you did for a long time and did very well. That is a huge problem. And your report, that's why your report's valuable. Gentlemen, I yield back to the gentleman who was out.